There are nights in Oxford when the bells carry farther than sense allows, striking across stone quadrangles and shuttered gardens like a voice calling for an answer long since buried. That night I paused in Cornmarket, the pavement still slick from an hour's rain, and let the muffled chorus from Christ Church drift down the wind. The notes sounded strangely hollow, as though a door had been closed between the choir and their God. I lit a cigarette and waited for the city to quiet itself. Though Oxford never entirely falls silent, it only pretends. I had been asked, gently urged perhaps, to attend a rehearsal of the choir at St. Swithin's College. Nothing in my calendar had demanded refusal, though I confess the prospect of sitting in a cold chapel while young men strained after Palestrina did not thrill me. Yet something in the phrasing of the invitation and insistence beneath the courtesy stirred my curiosity. When people conceal a reason, it is usually more compelling than the one they supply. The porter let me in with little ceremony, remarking that the master was away, though he declined to say where. His reticence was nothing unusual. In Oxford, secrets are less often locked away than they are sung in Latin, hidden in plain chant. I followed the scent of wax and stone dust into the chapel, where the choir had already begun. I recognized the hymn, its cadences echoed a crossword clue I had solved earlier in the day, Dies Irae, a day of wrath, though here rendered sweet and plaintive. Music, like words, has its paradoxes. It was not the music, however, that caught me, but the faces. Most sang with dutiful absorption, eyes on the worn sheets. Yet one young man second row near the aisle kept glancing not at his notes, nor at the conductor, but towards the darkened transept. His gaze was neither fearful or idle. It was, I thought, a look of rehearsal, as though waiting for something rehearsed to begin. That unease threaded itself into the harmony, unsettling the ear. I tucked the observation away, like a corner piece of a puzzle whose picture I had not yet seen. Afterwards I drifted among them in the vestry, making the sort of remarks expected from a visitor of uncertain authority. The conductor, a narrow man with anxious hands, offered a thin smile and explained that the choir was preparing for a memorial service, though he did not specify whose. The omission was too careful to be accidental. One never avoids a name without a reason. A young tenor, overhearing, muttered something about shadows, and the remark was quickly smothered by laughter not quite genuine. I pretended not to notice. Pretense often proves more revealing than interrogation. Walking back across the quad, I paused beneath a dripping gargoyle. A college servant passed me, head bowed, carrying a bundle of robes. The bundle sagged oddly, too heavy for fabric alone. He turned sharply into a side door before I could remark upon it. I made no move to follow deduction, as it is seldom advanced by haste. But the unease in the chapel had followed me out into the rain. Somewhere behind those shuttered windows, the truth waited with its patient malice. By the time I reached my flat, the bells had ceased, leaving only the distant hiss of tires on wet tarmac. I poured a measure of whiskey, sat by the window, and opened the crossword I had abandoned earlier. A clue I had overlooked leapt at me now, 7 letters, Requiem, a mass for the dead. Too easy, I thought, yet somehow the word seemed insistent, as if it had been waiting for me to return. I wrote it in, though uneasily. In Oxford, even the simplest words conceal their shadows. I did not yet know whose requiem awaited me, nor why the choir rehearsed with such tension in their throats. But already the first note had been struck, and it reverberated in places I could not name. The city has a way of luring one into mysteries under the guise of courtesy, and as I extinguished the lamp, I felt certain that the darkness inside St. Swithin's was deeper than the night outside my window. The announcement came not with drama, nor with any kindness of warning, but through the banal formality of a note left at my door. An envelope, unsealed, the paper smudged slightly where the drizzle had reached it before the porter pushed it beneath. I opened it without ceremony and read the words twice, though the second reading added nothing to the first. The master of St. Swithin's had died, no details offered. Only the time and place of the service, and a polite presumption of my attendance. Oxford is skilled at such gestures, polished, bloodless, and unyielding. I remember sitting back in the chair, the whisky on the table, left untasted. The letter had the peculiar chill of inevitability, as if the death had been rehearsed by the college long before the master's body consented to it. I found myself recalling the silence in the chapel the previous night, that strained chord in the choir's throat, the tenor's muttered word about shadows. Death has a way of preparing its stage in whispers. Perhaps I had already been seated in the audience without knowing it. When I walked to the college the following morning, the city seemed unusually subdued, though that might only have been my ear for such things. Rain had softened the cobbles into a sheen that reflected the spires like uncertain memories. A cluster of dons in their gowns stood beneath the arch, speaking in tones so muted they sounded like monks reciting litanies. One recognized me, lifted a hand in faint acknowledgment, and asked whether I had heard. I told him I had, and he nodded as though my confirmation mattered. It struck me then that in Oxford knowledge itself is a kind of currency, and death merely another form of transaction. Inside the lodge the porter confirmed what the note had left unsaid. The master had been found in his rooms, alone. He had not risen for breakfast, and by the time the servant entered, the air was heavy with the smell of split port and something less definable. The coroner, summoned discreetly, had offered the expected phrase heart failure before withdrawing to leave the college to its mourning. Too tidy, I thought, though I let the words pass unchallenged. Death, especially in Oxford, is rarely as tidy as it wishes to appear. In the senior common room the atmosphere was close, the fire lit though the day was mild. A few fellows sat in chairs too large for them, their expressions arranged into masks of solemnity. One, a classics tutor with a taste for self-dramatization, remarked that the master had always been too fond of his claret. Another suggested that late nights in the library had worn him thin. Their voices skimmed the surface of grief without breaking it. Yet in the corner, a younger don kept turning his teaspoon in the saucer again and again, the porcelain clicking like a metronome. He did not speak. He looked instead at the door. I took a seat and allowed the talk to wash over me. What interested me was not their conjectures but their omissions. No one mentioned the memorial service for which the choir had been preparing. No one asked why the conductor had spoken of a memorial before the master's death had been declared. That silence pressed against me more heavily than their words. I recalled the young chorister's furtive glances into the transept, the servant carrying the sagging bundle of robes, too many shadows gathered in too short a time for coincidence. Later, in the library, I found myself drifting along the rows until my eye rested on a volume of Donne. I pulled it down at random, opened to a page, and read the familiar line. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind. Yet I felt no diminution, only a sharpening of curiosity. On the opposite page, a student hand had penciled a note, 2 words, faint, almost erased, not natural. The irony was not lost on me, marginalia, the truest confession. As I left, I passed the chapel once more. The choir rehearsed again, though more raggedly now. Their voices faltered on the word, miserere, have mercy, and the conductor struck the stand sharply to recall their attention. Mercy is not a word Oxford utters easily. I paused at the door, unseen, and listened until the chant dissolved into silence. It seemed to me that the college itself was singing not for the master, but for some larger, unspoken reckoning. That night, in my room, I poured the whisky I had denied myself before, and considered the crossword folded beside me. One clue remained unanswered, 6 letters, beginning with M, a synonym for death. The solution came with disquieting swiftness: tomorrow. Tomorrow. The words sat there with unsettling clarity, as though promising that the master's death was not the last. I left the space blank. Some answers, I have always believed, are best left unwritten. There are places in Oxford where time itself appears reluctant to proceed, and St. Swithin's cloisters were among them. I walked there in the half-light of late afternoon, the rain holding itself in the air like breath withheld, the flagstones darkened by a moisture that never quite dried. The college had pulled itself into mourning with practised efficiency blinds drawn halfway, the porter's steps muffled, notices pinned to boards in neat, italic hand. Yet beneath the solemnity I sensed something more stubborn, something that did not wish to be touched by grief at all. The cloisters were almost deserted, save for a fellow in his gown, pacing the far side, lips moving silently in rehearsal of words not meant for anyone's ear. He saw me, hesitated, then inclined his head with reluctant civility. I did not press him. Words spoken too quickly rarely yield their weight. Instead, I let my attention linger on the architecture itself, the stone that had witnessed centuries of whispered alliances, betrayals, and the quiet, unrecorded cruelties of academic life. A cloister, after all, is not merely a place of shelter, it is also a cage. I found myself thinking of the master, and how he must have walked here countless times, his gown brushing the damp stone, his thoughts perhaps more shadowed than any of us had cared to notice. People seldom look closely at those who lead them. It is enough that the semblance of authority is maintained. Yet death has a way of stripping the varnish from power, leaving only the splintered grain beneath. The question was not why he had died, but whether the college truly mourned his absence or quietly welcomed it. In the corner of the cloister stood a notice board for the choir. A schedule was pinned there, the dates carefully inscribed, but one line caught my eye, a memorial service marked in ink, darker than the rest, and beneath it the faint indentation of words erased but not entirely lost. Leaning closer, I traced them with my eyes until the phrase revealed itself for the master. The date, curiously, had been altered, originally a week earlier, overwritten with a hand more hurried than careful. I felt the small thrill of deduction stir someone had planned for his death before it had occurred, and then adjusted the announcement when reality refused to align itself neatly. A clerical error, perhaps, but clerical errors in Oxford are rarely innocent. I turned away and entered the passage leading to the library. The air changed there, filled with the familiar odour of vellum and ink, the faint musk of volumes opened too seldom. A librarian, bent almost double with age, asked whether I sought anything particular. I replied that I was merely browsing, and he accepted this as one accepts the inevitability of rain. He shuffled away, his keys jangling like faint accusations in the silence. It was in the reference section that I noticed another detail, small enough to be overlooked by anyone not in the habit of scanning margins. A book of college statutes lay open on the desk, abandoned. The page described procedures for electing a new master, yet in the margin a hand different from the neat Latin scrawl elsewhere had written a single word, sooner. The ink was fresh enough to glisten faintly when caught by the lamp. Someone had been here recently, impatient with tradition's pace. As dusk pressed itself against the leaded windows, I returned to the cloisters. They seemed darker now, the stone absorbing what little light remained. The pacing fellow was gone, leaving only the echo of his footsteps still clinging to the arches. I stood there a moment, listening to the emptiness, and thought how Oxford prides itself on permanence, yet is forever rearranging itself beneath the surface. Death, appointment, succession, these were not intrusions but continuities. The cloisters were not silent, they were whispering, if only one could hear. Back in my room, I unfolded the crossword again. A clue awaited the enclosed world. 7 letters. I tried cloister, but it did not quite fit the crossing letters. Instead, another word suggested prison. I wrote it in, though uneasily. The cloisters of St. Swithin's were both. A place to contemplate eternity, and a place from which no truth easily escaped. I have always believed that Oxford's real history lies not in its grand architecture or its cherished myths, but in the quiet corners where ink outlives memory. The registry at St. Swithin's was one such place, a narrow chamber tucked behind the bursar's office, where dust settled like sediment on shelves, and silence lay heavy enough to be mistaken for reverence. The clerks worked there without acknowledgement, their eyes reddened by candlelight, their handwriting destined to outlast their faces. It was here, among the ledgers and inscriptions, that I began to sense the first outlines of something more deliberate than grief. I had asked to see the admission rolls, a simple enough request couched in terms of curiosity. The deputy registrar, a thin man who smelt faintly of mothballs, complied without hesitation, leading me to the oak table where volumes the size of tombstones waited to be consulted. The bindings were cracked, the vellum brittle, yet the ink still sang black and sure, as though permanence could be preserved by calligraphy alone. He left me there, trusting me not to disturb what time had already half consumed. Turning the pages, I traced the neat lines of names, dates, sponsors. Most bore nothing unusual, sons of county rectors, daughters of barristers, all the usual tributaries flowing into Oxford's river of privilege. But then, at the edge of one page, an erasure caught my eye, a name scraped away with deliberate force, the parchment thinned and scarred. Over it, another hand had written a different name, one I recognized faintly from the choir's list. I lingered on it, feeling the subtle jolt of recognition from the young man whose eyes had searched the transept during rehearsal. His place at the college, it seemed, had once belonged to someone else, and someone had taken the trouble to make that absence almost invisible. Almost. Later, I moved to the library's inscription desk, where books once gifted to the college were catalogued. The room smelt of mildew and polish, the air close with the odour of slowly rotting bindings. A librarian fussed around me, remarking that benefactions were the backbone of the college, that every inscription carried its small history. I nodded absently, running a finger down the neat columns of donors' names, until I reached an entry that stood out for its brevity, anonymous, 1983. The book itself a psalter bound in calfskin sat in the glass cabinet above, its dedication page untouched by time. But in the bottom corner, faint and nearly invisible, someone had penciled 3 initials. They matched the erased name from the registry. The dead have ways of writing themselves back into the margins, if one cares to look. When I returned the volume, the librarian asked if I had found what I needed. I told him only that I had found enough. His expression tightened, as if the word itself carried menace. People who live among inscriptions grow wary of interpretation. They know too well how fragile truth can be once it is written down. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft at first, then insistent, hammering against the cloister windows like fingers on glass. I stood there listening, the sound almost musical, and remembered something the conductor had said when I remarked upon the difficulty of keeping boys attentive in rehearsal. Discipline, he had replied, comes from knowing that every note is counted. His phrase had struck me then as pedantic, but in the registry it seemed to echo differently. Every name, every alteration was a note in a larger composition, and someone had altered the score. Back in my room, I unfolded the crossword. A clue remained unsolved in letters to erase or obscure. I tried obliterate, which fit, but it felt too heavy. Another word came instead, efface. To wipe out, to remove as though it had never been. I wrote it in, but uneasily. Because effacement is never perfect, it always leaves its trace like a scar under the skin, waiting for the eye that cares to notice. And so the erased name in the registry, the penciled initials in the psalter, and the altered choir list they seem to hum with a single, insistent refrain. Oxford preserves everything, even its concealments, especially its concealments. It was in the chapel again that I began to hear the discord, not the musical kind, though it masqueraded as such, but the sort that stirs unease beneath polished surfaces. The choir rehearsed Palestrina under the conductor's baton, their voices rising in pale imitation of devotion. Yet something wavered in their unity, a thin fracture that refused to seal itself. A mislaid entry here, a faltering breath there, but more than an accident. Distraction, or perhaps fear, threaded through the harmony like a worm in fruit. I took my seat at the back, unnoticed. The lamplight fell unevenly, catching dust that swirled above the pews. My attention, however, was fixed, less on the sound than on the small gestures between them. The young man whose name had been erased in the registry, restored by another hand, though under another's name, sang with his head lowered, lips barely moving. The boy beside him cast furtive glances toward the aisle, as if waiting for someone who never arrived. And the conductor, twitching at the smallest lapse, seemed less a leader of voices than a sentinel guarding a threshold none of them dared cross. When they paused, I remarked idly that the harmony sounded strained. He bristled at once, insisting the boys were under pressure, that the service was near, that perfection demanded vigilance. I let him speak, my eyes wandering to the score he clutched. The corners were frayed, pages marked with more annotations than any one rehearsal could require. One note especially caught my attention, a small cross in the margin beside the Kyrie. The mark was faint, yet deliberate. I asked, with feigned casualness, whether the Kyrie posed particular difficulties. He hesitated, then muttered something about its length. The evasion was transparent, but I did not press. In Oxford, silence is more eloquent than confession. After rehearsal, I lingered in the vestry. The boys scattered quickly, laughter breaking through once they thought themselves unseen, as though the music itself had been an imposition. Only one stayed behind the same tenor, who had muttered of shadows. He fiddled with his cassock, head bent. I asked him if he liked singing. He replied that he did, but his voice faltered. Then, as if compelled, he added that the master had promised him something once, and now that promise was gone. Before I could ask what promise, the conductor appeared, brusque, sending him off with a glance sharp enough to silence further confidence. I stored the fragment away. Promises, like debts, seldom vanish cleanly. Walking back through the cloister, I found myself listening to the rain pattering on the lead gutters. It seemed to echo the faltering notes I had just heard. Discord rarely announces itself in thunder. It seeps in gently, like water through stone. At the lodge, the porter stopped me. He spoke in the guarded tone of one who fears his words might travel farther than his lips. He mentioned that the master had quarrelled with someone shortly before his death, though he could not or wouldn't say who. I asked how he knew. He replied that voices carry in the cloister, especially angry ones. I thanked him, and his eyes darted to the chapel, as though the stones themselves might overhear. That night in my room I spread out the choir's schedule, which I had copied from the board. Dates, times, annotations, all seem ordinary. Yet one rehearsal had been added at the last minute, squeezed between others without symmetry. An insertion, not part of the original pattern. I compared it with the marginal mark in the conductor's score and felt the edges align. Someone had ensured a gathering at a moment that suited them, not the music. The discordant note was not in the voices, but in the design. I poured a whiskey, opened the crossword, and stared at a clue I had avoided all weekend letters meaning out of tune. I tried dissonance. It fit perfectly. Yet the word unsettled me. Dissonance is not always failure. Sometimes it is preparation, the necessary prelude to a resolution not yet heard. The choir, the erased name, the quarrel whispered across cloisters, all these fragments struck together like notes seeking a chord. What unsettled me was not their disharmony, but the suspicion that the true resolution, when it came, would be darker than any requiem they rehearsed. I closed the book, let the lamp burn low, and listened to the silence settling over Oxford. Even silence, I thought, carries its own discord, if only one has ears to hear it. It is a peculiar thing how swiftly the appearance of concord can collapse. One moment Oxford arranges itself into ritual precision, the cloisters swept, the chapel lamps lit, the voices trained to rise in unison. And then, with the smallest fracture, the illusion buckles. I sat again in St. Swethin's chapel that evening, watching the boys rehearse. From a distance their sound was sweet enough, but as I leaned into it, the harmony betrayed itself like a tapestry fraying beneath its sheen. Too much effort pressed upon too little conviction. They sang not together, but against one another. The conductor noticed me, though he pretended otherwise. His gestures grew sharper, baton cutting the air, as though he could carve obedience out of reluctance. Yet obedience is a brittle thing. One boy missed his entry and was punished with a glance so cutting it might have silenced him forever. I thought of the erased name in the registry, the penciled initials in the psalter, and wondered what kind of obedience those shadows demanded. Afterwards, in the vestry, I let slip a comment about the choir's improvement. He thanked me curtly, though his eyes flicked sideways as if awaiting contradiction. I remarked that the Kyrie seemed heavy under their tongues. He frowned, then said that grief has a way of unbalancing the voice. His tone was clipped, but the words trembled with something closer to fear. It occurred to me then that he rehearsed not for music, but for concealment, every bar line a barrier against what must not surface. The boys filed past us, voices raised now in ordinary chatter. One mentioned the master's portrait being removed from hall. Another muttered that it was only fitting. Their laughter carried a note too brittle to be innocent. I remembered how the porter had overheard quarrels. Laughter, like anger, carries. It betrays its origin long after the sound itself fades. Walking back across the quad, I was stopped by a fellow of the college. He asked whether I thought the choir prepared. I replied that they sang well enough, and he smiled faintly, saying that well enough would suffice. His phrase struck me more than it ought. Well enough is what Oxford says when perfection is impossible, but pretense still required. It is the phrase of compromise, of things smoothed over rather than understood. Later that evening I returned to the library where the registers and inscriptions still weighed upon me. The psalter remained in its cabinet, the initials barely visible. But I recalled the faint cross in the conductor's score beside the Kyrie and felt the echo between page and voice. Symbols repeated themselves in different registers, like themes in a fugue. And fugues, I reminded myself, are built not on harmony but on pursuit, one line forever chasing another. Back in my room I sat with the crossword. The clue that night was 7 letters, meaning agreement that is not genuine. I tried accordion, which fit poorly. Then another word arrived, concord, but with a question mark beside it. Finally I saw harmony, though false. The answer was semblance, a form without substance. I wrote it down and felt its weight settle against everything I had seen. The choir's strained voices, the conductor's evasions, the altered registry. A semblance of unity masking the fracture beneath. I poured a whiskey and let the rain on the window pane accompany my thoughts. False harmony is more dangerous than open discord. Discord at least admits its conflict, but harmony, when it lies, persuades others to lie with it. St. Swithin's wore its mourning like well-tailored cloth, yet the stitching was loose. A tug here, a slip there, and the garment would fall apart. As I closed the book, I found myself listening again to the silence. Not absence of sound, but a silence composed, deliberate, heavy with the weight of unsung notes. In Oxford, silence itself is a chorus that sings only what others refuse to hear. The past in Oxford never disappears. It lingers like damp in stone, seeping into every corridor, staining even the air with remembrance. That evening, I walked through the cloisters of St. Swithin's with the uneasy sense that I was being observed, though the quad lay empty, and the only sound was the soft trickle of rain slipping from the gutters. The gas lamps flared against the wet pavement, and in their glow I saw my own reflection more vividly than any companion. It seemed appropriate. The living in Oxford are never quite alone. They walk alongside their predecessors, pressed into service by memory. I had spent the afternoon in the archives once more. The records yielded less than I had hoped, though not nothing. A set of correspondence bound in fading ribbon had been tucked between more official papers, letters from the 1970s that Oxford would rather forget, written in a hurried hand, words pressed so hard into the paper they almost tore it. The master, then a younger Don, had been involved in disputes over admissions. His letters spoke of merit, of fairness, yet beneath the rhetoric a sharper tone prevailed, almost desperate. One name recurred, first tentatively, then as an accusation the same erased name I had seen in the registry. The letters hinted at impropriety, but never stated it. Oxford seldom says what it means directly. It prefers shadows and trusts that those willing to search will decipher the rest. When I closed the folder, I noticed my own fingers smudged faintly with ink. It gave me the peculiar feeling of complicity, as if I too had altered the record by touching it. Perhaps that is why the past unnerves us. It refuses to remain untouched. Every attempt to examine it leaves us marked in turn. Later, in the hall, the dons gathered for supper. The benches gleamed with polish, the portraits watched with their usual haughtiness. Talk was subdued, voices pressed low. Someone mentioned the upcoming memorial service, another speculated about who might succeed the master. I caught the bursar's eye across the table. He looked away too quickly, as though the question of succession were not speculation at all, but already decided. I poured myself another glass and said little. Words, in that setting, felt like stones dropped into water ripples would spread further than intended. It was only when I left hall that I saw the young tenor standing at the far end of the passage, his cassock folded over his arm. He seemed about to speak, but when our eyes met, he turned sharply into the darkness. His retreat left an after-image more vivid than his presence, the hesitation before flight, the almost spoken word. I wondered what he carried that silence refused to contain. Promises, debts, or secrets, perhaps all three. Back in my rooms, I spread the letters across the table, letting the lamplight fall unevenly on them. Phrases leapt out unsuitable, improper, reconsidered, and always that name, effaced in the registry, penciled in the psalter, whispered in correspondence. I felt the pattern stirring, though incomplete, like a fugue missing its final entry. And with it came a thought I disliked, that the master's death was less an end than a continuation. The past, restless, had simply demanded its due. The crossword lay beside me, its squares waiting. One clue resisted me all week, 8 letters, meaning something long remembered. I tried the memory, but it lacked the length. I tried to recollect, but the letters crossed poorly. At last the word formed revenant, not just memory, but a return, the past stepping again into the present. I wrote it down with reluctant certainty. Oxford, I thought, is full of revenants. They do not rattle chains or haunt staircases. They alter registries. They whisper from the margins of old letters. They stand silent in corridors until you meet their gaze and recognize them. I extinguished the lamp, but even in the dark the words seemed to linger, suspended like voices left unsung. The shadows of the past were not behind me. They walked in step beside me, waiting with infinite patience for their turn to speak. Her name had been mentioned in passing, before once by the bursar, once in a tone of dismissal from the conductor, but Clara herself had remained at the edges of the story until she chose not to. It was late afternoon when she sent word, a note folded hastily and slipped beneath my door, asking that I meet her in the old music room above the cloister. No signature was required. In Oxford, handwriting is often enough to betray the writer. The room was half dark when I arrived, a single lamp humming faintly, its glow reflected on the polished lid of a piano long out of tune. Dust lay heavy across the keys, but I noticed one had been pressed recently, a pale print interrupting the film. Clara sat in the corner, her hands folded, her hair drawn back too tightly, the sort of precision that betrays unease. She looked at me without speaking, as though weighing whether silence might serve her better after all. When she did begin, her words came quickly, as though rehearsed. She told me that she had been close to the master, closer than most had cared to notice, and that their connection had not been entirely respectable by Oxford's rigid standards. I asked whether she spoke of affection or arrangement. She replied both, though her voice cracked on the word. The master, she said, had promised to support her fellowship, but that promise, like so many others in this city, had collapsed under pressure from unnamed voices in the senior common room. She smiled then, not bitterly, but with a kind of exhausted irony. Promises in Oxford are like drafts of music, she said. They sound fine in rehearsal, but vanish before the performance. I let her speak. Her account carried the rhythm of confession, not the accuracy of testimony. She admitted to quarrelling with him, to demanding what he had sworn would be hers, and then, lower, almost inaudible, she admitted that she had seen him alive the night before he was found. She had left his room after midnight. He had been drinking, she said, and the bottle had not been the first. She swore he was alive when she walked away. Her eyes fixed on me, wide, imploring. I found myself wishing I believed her. But belief has little weight in Oxford, where truth wears disguises as easily as gowns. A sound from the courtyard below broke her words, the shuffle of steps, the closing of a door. She flinched, then steadied herself. There was more, she whispered. She had known of the erased name in the registry, though she refused to say how. She hinted that the boy in the choir had once been promised that place, and that the master had used his influence to adjust what could not easily be justified. She stopped there, pulling the silence around her like a cloak. I pressed her gently, but she shook her head. Enough had been spoken, the rest would remain in shadow. When I left her, the cloister was already dark, the lamps just being lit. I thought of her handprint on the piano key, the one note pressed into dust, as if to prove she had been there at all. Confessions like that key do not restore the music. They only mark the silence that follows. Later in my room, I opened the crossword. A clue caught my eye, 6 letters meaning to admit or concede. The answer offered itself instantly, but beside it another clue lingered 10 letters meaning incomplete truth. I hesitated, then filled in half answer. Clara's confession had been both, enough to disturb the stillness, not enough to resolve it. As I laid down my pen, I felt the weight of her voice pressing into the room. Confessions are seldom final. They are openings, not conclusions. What Clara had given me was not resolution, but another discordant note, one that demanded accompaniment. The harmony of St. Swithin's was still false, but its fractures were beginning to sound more clear. Oxford breeds distractions as readily as it breeds mould in its damp stone walls. It is not malice, but a kind of instinct the city offers that looks like the truth, polished and convincing, only to reveal in time that it was a diversion. That evening I began to understand how many such diversions had been laid before me. The master's drinking, Clara's fellowship, the mutterings in the cloisters all pulled taut. Yet when tugged, they unravelled into nothing stronger than smoke. The more I followed, the more the trail dissolved, until only silence remained. And yet it was the silence itself that began to speak. I returned to Clara's confession in my mind, replaying her words as I walked across the quad. She had insisted that she left him alive. I believed her, or half believed her, but the more I considered it, the less it mattered. Her quarrel, her promises, her tears were the substance of Oxford life, intensely felt, endlessly rehearsed, and ultimately incidental. They were red herrings draped across the path to keep one from noticing the quiet, persistent detail lodged just beneath. What lingered in me was not her claim, but her gesture, the handprint on the piano key. Why touch the instrument at all unless to prove something, if only to herself? I realized then that confessions can be rehearsed just as carefully as hymns. I found myself in the porter's lodge. The man was dozing, but when he roused, he told me the police had asked their questions already and no doubt would return. He shrugged, as if the weight of official curiosity left no mark on him. I asked whether he had known Clara long. He said yes, long enough, and added that she was never where she ought to be. He chuckled, though there was little humour in it. Then, almost idly, he mentioned that she was seen in the archives the night before the master's death. That, I thought, was something she had not confessed. The shadow lengthened. Later, in the senior common room, the dons had resumed their murmuring. The air smelt of brandy and old upholstery, the sort of atmosphere that lulls one into believing nothing serious could ever happen there. A fellow leaned across to me and whispered that rumours circulated of debts, of favours owed, of disputes so old no one quite remembered their beginnings. The words circled like smoke. I nodded, offered a polite phrase, and let the voices fade. Rumours are Oxford's most abundant crop, and like red herrings they spoil quickly once exposed to light. That night, in my room, I examined the choir's schedule again. My eye returned to the rehearsal inserted awkwardly into the sequence. It had been meant to draw attention away from something else, I now felt certain. The boys, the conductor, Clara, the bursar, all of them had been offered to me as explanations, yet none of them explained. The false harmony was too elaborate. And yet, if one ignored the noise, a simpler melody emerged, faint but persistent. Someone had planned, carefully enough, to adjust dates in both registry and choir books to conceal a truth not yet revealed. The crossword lay open on my desk. That evening's clue was a misleading clue, 3 words often found in detective stories. I smiled without pleasure. The answer was red herring. I filled it in, and for the first time in days the grid felt complete, as though it had been waiting only for that recognition. But the satisfaction was tempered. A red herring fades, yes, but not without leaving its stain. It colours every deduction, every assumption, and only later does one see how much time it has cost. I poured a whiskey, letting the amber catch the lamplight, and thought again of the master's death. Heart failure, the coroner had said. Convenient, perhaps even true. But the truth in Oxford was never simple. Clara's confession had guided me into her shadows. The choir's faltering voices had offered their diversions. The fellows' whispers had clouded the air. And still, the one question that mattered most had not been asked loudly enough, not who quarrelled or who promised, but who profited. I set down the glass without drinking. Outside, the rain began once more, striking the panes with gentle insistence. A sound at once familiar and elusive, like the past returning in fragments. The red herring was fading, its colour bleeding away. What remained was darker, quieter, and closer to the truth than I cared to admit. There are symbols Oxford delights in more than truth itself, and none more so than the chalice. It stands on every altar, carved into crests, etched into glass, as though the city could not bear to admit its thirst without sanctifying it. Yet the chalice I found myself contemplating that evening was not the vessel of sacrament, but the one taken from the sacristy, placed back in the cabinet as if nothing had happened. I noticed it only because the polish was too recent. Silver does not gleam like that unless someone has tried to erase a trace. I asked the verger when it had last been used. He replied that it had stood, untouched, since the master's final service. He said it lightly, without suspicion, as though the word final carried no weight. Yet his eyes betrayed him, darting to the cupboard before returning to me. I thanked him, feigning indifference, but the phrase lodged in me the master's final service. Oxford seldom chooses words idly, and sometimes I thought, it is not the wine but the vessel itself that betrays us. In the cloisters later I encountered Clara. She seemed unsettled, her voice thinner than before. She remarked that the college was restless, that rumours of poison had begun to circulate. I asked her whether she believed them. She hesitated, then said only that the master had many enemies. Her answer was less a response than a deflection. I noticed her hand tighten around the strap of her bag, a small tremor running through her fingers. People rarely tremble for fear of gossip. They tremble when they sense that gossip may find its way into fact. That night, I examined the choir's rehearsal notes once more. Beside the Kyrie, the faint cross in the conductor's score returned to me, echoing the mark upon the chalice lid. 2 different objects, 2 different contexts, yet the same symbol of invocation. I wondered whether the cross had been a sign of difficulty or of intention. Music and ritual, both requiring precision, both requiring concealment when precision faltered. The following day, at the memorial service, the chalice stood again upon the altar. I sat in the shadows, watching. The boys sang with a steadiness they had not managed before, as though fear had disciplined their voices more effectively than rehearsal ever could. When the verger lifted the vessel, a hush fell. I thought absurdly that someone might still fall in the act of drinking, though the wine remained untouched. Symbol, not substance, The true poison had already done its work. Afterwards, in the vestry, I asked the conductor about the mark in his score. He looked at me with something between disdain and fatigue, and replied that it reminded him where to hold the boys longer on a note. His explanation was plausible, too plausible, and carried the well-rehearsed tone of a man who had prepared it in advance. Yet as he turned away, I noticed a stain on his cuff, faint, reddish, not wine and not blood, but something that refused to fade even under laundering. He tucked his sleeve quickly, but the gesture arrived too late. Some marks, once made, refuse effacement. That evening in my room I opened the crossword. One clue demanded my attention, 7 letters meaning hidden danger. I tried hazard, then peril, but neither fit. At last the word poison appeared, simple, obvious, and yet I had avoided it until the letters forced me. I wrote it in with reluctance, the pencil point digging harder into the paper than I intended. Poison in Oxford was not confined to chalices. It seeped through registries, through erased names, through whispered promises and failed loyalties. It disguised itself as harmony, as confession, as charity, but always with the same effect of slow corruption. The chalice gleamed in my mind as I set the puzzle aside. Whether it had carried death or merely the suggestion of it mattered less than the fact that it had been touched, polished, replaced. Objects, like people, do not lie well. They carry their histories in silence, waiting for someone to notice the reflection left behind. I drained my glass, tasting not whiskey, but the metallic echo of silver. The poison in the chalice was never only in the wine, it was in the act of lifting it, in the trust betrayed by ritual, in the quiet knowledge that every vessel holds more than it declares. The arrest, when it came, was not dramatic. No handcuffs clattered, no cries rose across the quad. Oxford would never tolerate such noise. It arrived instead with the hush of autumn leaves falling on wet stone, with the inevitability of dusk descending upon the cloisters. I was there, though my role was little more than to observe, to feel the weight of the silence that accompanied it. It had been decided by others, of course. Official channels had been engaged, papers signed, words exchanged in tones so clipped they might have been mistaken for courtesy. Yet in the end, it was simply 2 constables walking up the staircase of St. Swithin's, their boots softened by carpet runners worn thin by centuries of procession. They knocked once, entered, and emerged some minutes later, with the conductor walking between them. His face carried neither outrage nor surprise, only fatigue, like a man who had been rehearsing this role all his life. No struggle, no protest. He adjusted his coat with the same precision with which he had once adjusted the choir's timing. I followed at a distance. The boys in the choir watched from the cloister, their faces pale, their whispers breaking into sudden silence when he passed. One of them, perhaps the tenor who had once spoken of shadows, clutched his hymnbook so tightly the pages creased. I wondered if he would remember this moment as part of his music, or as something that broke it forever. Clara was there too, leaning against the wall, her expression unreadable. She did not move as he passed, only lowered her gaze, as though unwilling to grant him either pity or triumph. The constables led him into the waiting car. It drove away with no fanfare, only the quiet turning of tires on wet cobbles. The fellows of the college emerged shortly after, exchanging words about procedure, about continuity, about the need for dignity. Their phrases were as lifeless as the rain that continued to fall. I did not speak to them. Oxford thrives on appearances, and this, like all else, would be catalogued as another entry in its long record of disgraces politely forgotten. Later I sat alone in the library. The air was thick with the odour of old leather and extinguished candles. I pulled down a volume without looking, a miscellany of sermons, and opened it to a random page. The text declared that silence was a form of judgment more terrible than speech. I closed the book without finishing the passage. The silence of St. Swithin's that night did not feel like judgment. It felt like resignation, the kind that seeps into stone until no amount of polish can remove it. What struck me most, though, was the conductor's stillness. He had always been restless, his gestures sharp, his eyes darting to every flaw in the music. But in that final walk down the staircase he moved with uncanny calm, as though he had relinquished the need to control anything at all. Perhaps that was his confession, wordless though it was. In Oxford, some truths are admitted not by words, but by the absence of resistance. Back in my room, I poured a whisky and unfolded the crossword. The clue stared at me, 6 letters to surrender without struggle. I thought of submitting first, but the letters did not fit. Then I saw it clearly. I wrote it in, the pencil pressing harder than I intended, and felt the word echo the conductor's expression as he stepped into the rain. To relent is not to confess, nor to deny. It is simply to cease. I drank slowly, listening to the night settle itself over the city. The arrest was quiet, but quietness is not the same as peace. It leaves questions unanswered, shadows unmeasured, silences that thicken rather than disperse. Oxford has never needed drama to wound. It does its work in whispers, in footfalls, softened by stone, in the calm face of a man who no longer conducts anything at all. The case ended, not with revelation, but with something closer to silence, a silence that pressed upon the stones of St. Swithin's, heavy, unyielding, as though the college itself had grown weary of sound. The choir no longer rehearsed in the evenings. The cloisters lay empty, save for the drip of rain gathering in the gutters. The boys had been dismissed, sent home with murmured words about rest and study. Only the echo of their voices lingered, suspended in the rafters like smoke that would not dissipate. I found myself again in the chapel. It was late, the lamps dimmed, the air thick with the scent of extinguished candles. On the lectern lay a sheet of music, left behind as though forgotten. Kyrie, it read, the same passage is marked by the conductor's faint cross. I studied the notations, the pauses lengthened, the dynamics altered, and thought how music, like truth, can be bent to a will. What I held in my hand was not only a hymn, but a record of intention, though whether it condemned or exonerated its author remained beyond certainty. The conductor by then was removed with a dignity that did not quite disguise disgrace. Clara had vanished as well, taking with her both confession and silence. The fellows of the college spoke little of it now. They had returned to their routines, to their dinners and committees, as though a master had not died and a scandal had not quietly stained their walls. Oxford survives by forgetting, by allowing shadows to sink into the stone until they appear as part of its design. Yet forgetting did not come easily to me. I walked once more to the archives, to the place where I had first noticed the erased name in the registry. The page was still there, the scar of its alteration unmistakable. No one had sought to repair it. Effacement, once revealed, cannot be hidden again. I thought of the boy whose place had been taken, his furtive glances during rehearsal, his silence when laughter broke around him. He would remain at the college, his voice lost in the larger harmony, yet the shadow of that erasure would follow him. Sometimes the smallest wound alters the whole. That evening in my room I sat with the crossword. One final clue remained, 5 letters, meaning the end of a song. Coda, I wrote it in and stared at the word. It seemed too neat, too final, as if music could ever truly conclude. What lingers after the last note is not silence but resonance, a vibration that persists long after sound has ceased. The same, I thought, was true of this case. The facts might be set in order, the names recorded, the files closed, but the resonance endured. I poured myself a whisky and listened to the city outside. Bells tolled faintly from Christchurch, their sound blurred by the rain. A bicycle passed in the street, its tires hissing on the wet pavement. A woman's voice carried for a moment before fading into nothing. These small fragments of sound wove themselves together into something like music, though without resolution. It reminded me of the choir's final rehearsal, discordant, fragile, but undeniably human. Looking back, I cannot say with certainty what killed the master. Perhaps it was the poison in the chalice, perhaps only the weight of promises broken and debts unpaid, perhaps it was simply time. The conductor's arrest had satisfied the procedure, but not the truth. Clara's confession had offered intimacy, but not clarity. The erased name, the altered schedule, the polished chalice each spoke, but never in chorus. What remained was a fugue unfinished, its voices trailing away into silence. Oxford will move on. Another master will be elected. Another choir will sing. Another generation will write its names into registries that others will later erase. The city has always thrived on continuity, even when built upon omissions. Yet for me the memory persists, the scent of candle wax, the tremor in Clara's hand, the conductor's stillness as he walks into the rain. These fragments, fragile and incomplete, compose the only coda I possess. I set down my glass and closed the crossword. The grid was filled, but the puzzle remained. Outside, the bells ceased, leaving only the hush of rain on stone. I thought then of the last note of a hymn, how it lingers in the rafters long after the voices have fallen silent. It does not resolve. It simply fades, leaving the listener alone with the echo. That, I realized, was the true ending, not coda, not confession, not arrest. Only the last note, vanishing yet never entirely gone.